Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Greg Johnsen, who's CMO at GT Nexus. And today we're going to talk about the promised land of hyper-connected and synchronized supply chains. Now, this is a promised land that many companies have kind of embarked on, for many, many years and are still on that journey and haven't quite gotten there yet. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons why, perhaps, that's been such a difficult journey for some companies and what some companies have done to kind of get closer, to there. So very, very excited to have Greg on today and talk about this timely and important topic. Just want to remind you, if you're joining us live today, that if you do want to ask a question, you can do so via the submit a question button or the chat feature. And if it's a good and appropriate question, we can certainly try to weave it into the conversation. You do have to sign in if you are joining us as a visitor, you do have to sign in first before you can submit a question. With that, Greg, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. Good to be here.
So, Greg, kind of feeding off what I just said right now, I've often said that, obtaining timely, accurate, and complete supply chain visibility has been and continues to be kind of the most elusive goal for companies. Why do you think that's still the case?
Well, it's I think it is one of the core capabilities that companies need, and when you talk about visibility, it is about visibility to so much of the transactional data that occurs between companies or that gets generated by partners outside your company, and fundamentally, a lot of that data is data that is generated in a proprietary format. It might be generated in a system that is unlike your system. So the big challenge, the big barrier for a lot of companies has been a data challenge. It's about how to get data out of the systems of partners. And we're not talking about 2 partners or 3 partners. We're talking about hundreds or thousands. So that exercise of getting lots of very detailed transactional data, we're talking about order status information and shipment status information and inventory location information, and the rigor that you need to apply to get to good, high quality data has just been a very, very tough challenge for companies. And so I would say, yes, there are process challenges. Yes, there are social challenges. You've got to convince your network and your partners to work with you and get on board and generate data and connect with you. But there's a fundamental technology challenge, which is how do you translate that data? How do you synthesize it? How do you turn it into meaningful information that you can act on to run your business?
Yeah, we continue to see that challenge. Even just recently in the news, I mean, over the past week, I've written a couple of blog posts highlighting some recent news where, one case it was Home Depot talking about a new customer order management system they put in place, and during the earnings call, they talked about how they were still, with some of their suppliers, still transmitting orders via fax machines, right? And then, in more recent news this week, Reuters had an article about Target and some of the data challenges that they had in terms of poor data quality that was impacting their logistics processes. So let's talk about this connectivity thing, because I think I agree with you that kind of when you have so much data and information across so many systems, across so many trading partners, across so many geographies, it does, in addition to all the other challenges, it is a technology challenge as well in terms of trying to get all that data together. But at the one end, you still have companies, like I said, that are using fax machines and phone calls to exchange information with their trading partners. At the other end, you have companies that are using EDI, which is technology has been around for a very long time, but it's been mainly used between the large trading partners. So when we talk about hyper connected supply chains, how do companies actually get there? I mean, how do they reach that promised land?
Well, I think we're at a place now in history, in the evolution of technology, where we finally have a way to make that happen. And it's not just a question of connecting electronically with your partners. We have had EDI, and we have had software that you can buy and you can install to translate the many EDI feeds that you get from partners. So if you're looking for a shipment status update, which in the world of logistics is a EDI 315 message for ocean, and it's a 214 message for air freight, that that technology has been around, and so, but what you ended up with was a lot of separate integrations with hundreds of partners, and every partner speaks a different language. And the real thing that's happened is that we now have cloud platforms and technology that treat that communication between companies not as a one-to-one connection, but as a many-to-many platform that's not unlike social networks. So if you look at how Facebook operates or LinkedIn operates, where you have a profile and it's in the cloud, and we're not exchanging electronically with each other over Facebook per se. We're using the user interface and we're interacting that way. But the information model is when you make a change to your profile, you make it once in one place in the cloud, and everybody in the network gets the news automatically at light speed. And that's what's happening in business. That's what's happening now between companies. So what you have is companies who are connecting to a single platform and driving their information there, where the information, the data, gets translated once for everybody who cares and retranslated back into the systems of everybody around that network. So it's an information model. You're not making thousands of connections, you're making one connection, and the smarts for translating and synthesizing your data into a super language that anybody can consume is the real thing that's solving this. So, as you move to hyper connected supply chains, that's fundamental. That's what basically makes the data possible. So, if you agree that data is the new oil, that you can't really run your business unless you can gather the data from around it and put it in one place that you can exercise and act on, then that shift, that big innovation to sort of move to a cloud platform that looks more like a social network, or at least it behaves in that way, was really the thing that transformed it. So I think, connectivity has always been a challenge, and people have invested heavily in it, and they've invested heavily in EDI, and there are EDI standards. Yet, despite all of that, most companies can't see well. They can't really get to the information they need. We estimate something like 80% of the data that you need to execute in your supply chain is manufactured or held or managed beyond your four walls. Most companies have just 20% of it. So you need a platform that's going to synthesize the data from across hundreds of partners, put it in one place, and then you can begin to get to orchestration and process automation, the things that really will improve your business.
There's a couple of things there that I want to kind of dive into a little bit more. I mean, one is, you talked about, a lot of companies have made a lot of investments in EDI. I mean, when you talk about these new platforms, and I tend to call them supply chain operating networks, and I obviously I'm a big advocate of it. I've written a lot about it over the years, so I am, quote unquote biased, towards that model. So I'll be upfront about that. But then there's also the reality that companies have invested a lot of EDI. I mean, so if you are using EDI, how do you take advantage of these newer cloud platforms or supply chain operating networks? Does it replace them? Is it a question of leveraging your existing investments within these platforms? What are companies doing today in that area?
Well, in some ways, there is an element that is a wholesale shift or wholesale swap out. But on the other hand, if you're a company that has made lots of investment in EDI connectivity, you've already done a lot of there's so much more that has to happen. So the work of tying together your own systems to an outside integrated feed, for one thing. Any of the master data management work that you might have done inside your company to accommodate connections with partners is probably a path you've embarked on already and you're far along. The social experience of trying to work with outside third parties who have their own agendas and their other customers and other partners they have to work with. So the muscle memory that you develop in working with outside parties to get that done, all that is a core competency that you can leverage in this next domain. That doesn't go away. In fact, you've got a good running start at it. So the mechanisms, what will happen is you begin to switch over to this newer technology, these newer platforms, and you're moving a little faster than the companies that haven't made investments sooner. And then you just accelerate. I think that's because the data and the connectivity, at the end of the day, it's plumbing. It's in of itself, it's not super exciting. It's really necessary, really hard to do. It's been incredibly hard to do. But once that's behind you, you move on to the next thing, which is now you begin to automate processes, the transactions like order fulfillment or doing sophisticated supply chain maneuvers like customer direct shipments or DC bypass, or these are things that all of a sudden become possible because you've got a strong, solid foundation of data underneath you. And even the best companies, even the companies that made massive investments in EDI, still don't have anything close to, in our view, a solid foundation of data. It's been an expensive, hard, brittle experience, and that's why supply chain visibility, to go back to your opening remarks, is still one of the top challenges and top needs for companies. So we're at a watershed moment, I think, in supply chain history and in technology history, which is suddenly there are ways and mechanisms and technologies to help companies get to a hyper-connected supply chain network state.
I think the other thing, and I agree with those points, I think the other thing that's interesting that's perhaps a little bit more different today, or perhaps more important today, is the reality that, when I talk to supply chain executives, they talk about their biggest challenge being keeping up with the rapid pace of change. And we all know that supply chain management is really all about exception management, right? Nothing ever really goes according to plan. And, generally speaking, EDI systems are about computers talking to computers. And in a lot of cases, they're bulk transactions. There's a lot of latency built into the system. But the real challenge is, managing exceptions or being able to accelerate the flow of information to deal with, changes to the plan and so forth. And I think that's the opportunity where some of these newer platforms have, an advantage, if you will, or are able to address that reality better with the fact that, exceptions are the norm in supply chain management, and dealing with those exceptions kind of requires a different approach to getting data and communicating data and information, between trading partners much more quickly than EDI systems have historically enabled. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's a great insight, Adrian. And I think in some ways what you're talking about is what I think of as a shift to hyper execution. The ability, you can spend a lot of time planning, and a lot of companies have built good systems, good protocols, good process for planning. I'm thinking about sales and operation planning. I'm thinking about demand forecast, managing the plan and developing the plan and optimizing the plan. But if you look at the state of companies today, they're heavily outsourced. They work in a global environment. It's a dynamic environment. The competition is incredibly intense. Competitors coming from all over. The customer pressure to deliver different products or slightly tweaked products or a different level of service, that's intense. So, it's really become a game of how well you respond and how fast, as you say, you can respond. And the environment changes, so you can't predict or plan your way out of that. You need a plan, but the plan changes. If you look at an order, the typical purchase order in most industries, and I'm thinking now specifically of retail, footwear, and apparel, where 90% of the orders that get cut change. They change. Ship windows change, quantities change, endpoints change. You've got a demand spike, and all of a sudden you've got to change the destination of an order or the recipient of an order. So, it really is about being responsive and fast. And that's where this notion of networks and fast exchange of information becomes super important. You may not be able to replan everything, but you want to give information to all the operators on the ground, across the value chain, who are making decisions. And by the way, who have their own systems to make, to optimize and change and make decisions. So it really becomes a game, I think, where companies become much more competent and heavily weighted in their ability to execute and respond. And it doesn't mean they're backing off planning. It just means that for every dollar that you spend on planning, or you might have spent on planning 10 years ago, you're going to have to take that investment, that IT investment, and begin to push it towards faster collaboration, faster operational response, because it's impossible now to tune that demand forecast a little bit better or get that plan a little bit stronger. So I agree with you. I think it's all about good execution, good response, and the information systems we're talking about were built for that.
Well, let's talk about one of the things I hear a lot from companies whenever I get in this kind of discussion, in terms of connectivity and synchronizing your supply chain. And one of the things I hear is we need to get our own house in order, right, before we can even think about our supply chain, right? And I've come across a lot of supply chain executives who have tasked with quote unquote transformation projects. But most of those initiatives tend to be kind of internally focused, where they're looking to consolidate different IT systems within their companies and standardize on a single ERP platform, for example. And that's kind of what they mean by transformation, is really trying to create that common operating platform within their four walls, if you will. So on the one hand, I kind of see the valid argument, right? That, hey, how can we even think about doing a lot of this quote unquote sexy supply chain stuff, and exchanging data if we don't even have our own in-house systems in order and data in order. But I wonder, is that a valid argument? I mean, do you hear the same argument? What's your take on that kind of response from companies that say we've got to get our in-house our house in order first before we kind of tackle the extended supply chain?
It's it's definitely a dilemma. I think you put your finger right on it. On the one hand, that just seems to make sense. Why wouldn't we get our house in order first? But I think you no longer can wait to start looking out at the neighborhood. Yes, you're going to be working on your house for a long time. These are 10-year, 20-year. Look, we've been at it for 30, 40 years. We've been building the transactional enterprise backbone to handle systems of record and automation inside our companies for a long time. But the world has changed. The world has changed. It's, you look at the level of outsourcing and collaboration that has to happen to execute and operate as a company, and it's radically different. So I don't think you can wait any longer to start embarking on technology and transformational initiatives that connect your house with your neighborhood. And I also think I'll just say that in some ways it doesn't have to be a split the baby sort of situation necessarily, because I think supply chain overall needs more investment. If you look at the corporate allocation and look at what companies spend on marketing or selling or any of the traditional spend allocation areas, supply chain is the future. You look at the great supply chain companies. I mean, look at the most valuable company on the planet, Apple. Tim Cook is a supply chain executive, and that's a supply chain company. And you look at some of the great companies on the planet, they're supply chain companies. So, I happen to believe that the future belongs to great supply chain companies. And so I think companies need to be investing more in supply chain overall, but they need to especially be looking at systems that connect them with their partners. And to your point, Adrian, no, I don't think you can no longer look inward or just inward. You have to embark on initiatives that connect you with your suppliers and your third-party logistics providers and your customers, by the way. I mean, the road to customer growth and to customer differentiation and brand differentiation is supply chain. And so the systems that we're talking about are not systems of record, they're systems of engagement. And if you were to sort of make it really simple, I'd say we spent the last 30 or 40 years building systems of record to help us run our companies and record what has happened around our companies. And that recording is a little bit late, it's not always accurate, but we're very busy recording that picture and storing it. And the future is about, on the other side of the line, is about how to engage with the market. So that bright line, I think, is really what we're talking about. It looks like we lost Adrian there with a little bit of technical difficulty. So I'll continue down that track. I kind of know where he might be going with this, but that framework that we were just talking about, which is on the one hand systems of record, systems that we use to manage operations inside our company, which would be manufacturing, accounts receivable, accounts payable. And on the other hand, what we now call systems of engagement. These are systems that you use to connect with outside trading partners and service providers. And they complement each other and they relate to each other because when we're not just talking about how you engage, we're talking about the data and the information you get through those engagements and how you can fortify your systems of record. So for example, you may not have a very rich history or profile history around every order, every trade transaction that you've collected in your ERP system. But if you have a system of engagement, then you can complement that whole system of record and fortify it, make it more valuable. So if you want to do advanced analytics, and it looks like Adrian's back, welcome Adrian. We switched places in the grid here, so I'm on the left and you're on the right. But I was just wrapping up that sort of framework discussion of systems of engagement versus systems of record and talking about how they complement each other. And I think the way to look at this now is we're no longer companies that have good, strong systems of record inside our companies. We're companies that have two things: systems of record and very strong systems of engagement that connect us with our networks.
No, great. I apologize. I dropped off there for a few seconds, so I had to get myself back on. But I was able to hear you the whole time, and I love that. I love that terminology: systems of record versus systems of engagement. And I want to get back to that discussion around investments. In the question down the road. But let me before I get to that, so let's talk now. When we talk about hyper-connected and synchronized supply chains, what does the quote-unquote to-be state look like? In other words, what are the attributes that companies ought to strive toward?
Well, if you look at the top end, I don't think any of the traditional supply chain metrics go away. I mean, if you're tracking on time and in full, for example, in logistics for customer service, or you're looking to reduce first costs as a percentage, or reduce inventory, or accelerate turns, these all stay in place. But in general, state B, I mean, if we're in state A right now, which is not that well connected, very inwardly focused, working with limited and poor data, state B is you got access, real-time access, immediate access to the superset of data across your value chain at a detailed transactional level. And not only do you have real-time access to it, you can get to it anywhere. So it could be mobile, you're on your laptop, you can call anybody in your organization or your network and get to the data. So it's data, it's ubiquitous. And when you're in that state, when it looks like that, all those metrics improve. People talk about supply chain visibility, and we all know sort of intuitively it's good. Visibility equals good. That equation is sort of intuitive and we get it. But if you really drill into it, it's a very, very strong capability to acquire, because it takes visibility to get to lower transportation spend and lower inventory levels. And that connection is often misunderstood. I think we talked about data, we talked about getting into one place, and you talked about exceptions. It's really through visibility, which is not only seeing where inventory and shipments and orders are, but also layering on top of it the models that know where things ought to be. So in these repetitive supply chains where the cycle times between key gates, these models will pick up and show you and alert you when you're out of sync. And when you're doing that operationally, you end up catching exceptions sooner, correcting them, getting them back on track. And what you see in organizations is that their variability goes down. They actually reduce variability. And when you reduce variability, you reduce inventory. That input to the inventory algorithm changes. So you need less inventory because you can predict and trust that you're getting the inventory you need. So these hard metrics become, they don't go away, they just get better in hyper-connected organizations. But I'd say the most important thing that happens is that you become flexible. You become agile. And, companies, business networks change. You change out suppliers, you change out service providers, you launch new markets, and you have to be fast and responsive, not just operationally, but in terms of opportunity. And that's what a hyper-connected network, or the ability to get hyper-connected, can give you. Instead of taking 2 years to get a full electronic order fulfillment system up and running in Eastern Europe, you're doing it in 2 months or 3 months. So we're talking about big shifts in how fast you can get operational and efficient when you're a hyper-connected network.
No, great point. I think it goes back to that point I made earlier in terms of, again, the number one challenge I hear from supply chain executives is keeping up with that rapid pace of change. And I think, you kind of underscored that in terms of, one of the key, benefits that companies need to try to achieve in order to become, one of the key benefits of having a hyper-connected and synchronized supply chains. Now, you work with a lot of, manufacturers and retailers. I'm actually going to be heading out to a user conference next week, which I'm looking forward to, and being able to learn and network from some of your customers. So when you look at the manufacturers or retailers, the other companies you work with that have already embarked on this journey, this promise, toward the promised land of hyper-connected and synchronized supply chains, what are some of the best practices or lessons learned, from those companies?
Well, we've talked about one really important one in a way already, which is visibility first. Often, we'll see a company that is embarking on a transformational journey, and they may think of a super process, procure to pay, or origin operations, or trade financing, or better S&OP. But underpinning all these initiatives, we think, is that whole visibility framework and foundation. So the first thing we say, or the most important thing to acknowledge and push, is visibility first. And if you do that first, now that's not always obvious. I've seen a lot of maturity models, and I've seen companies that sort of subscribe to that notion of, well, you know what, we're going to tackle this process first, and over time, through that process, we're going to get the visibility we need. And it's true that there's a link. I mean, as you automate the procure-to-pay process, or you automate the order fulfillment process, or a receiving process, or a customer delivery process, you will embark on a visibility journey. But there are ways to emphasize and put a focus on data quality to get visibility right that will make everything else fly. So the first thing is visibility first. The second is, in the service of that mantra, is a rigorous approach to data quality. This does come down to working with partners to improve their data feeds, and no technology platform can solve that by itself. It takes people and politics and movement to get it to work. And so, we often say, and we see the best companies form a PMO, a program management office, where it's staffed by 3, 4, 5 people that are expert level project managers around working with partners, providing data quality dashboards, working with other companies in the industry to kind of get data quality up. But I would say that's a best practice for sure. Emphasize data quality, don't undercut it, don't assume you can outsource that to the politics and the social work of it to any technology company or even a partner. That's got to be a core competence. And last, I think some of what we've seen is that companies that are good at promoting what they do inside their companies, that supply chain is still a mystery to a lot of folks. So if you, as a supply chain executive, get your team or bring in the competence to communicate the plan, the destination, the vision, and then to be very, very crisp about how you communicate status and that story, that narrative, that story of A to B. That's a best practice. I mean, I look at companies like Pfizer, Jim Cafone over at Pfizer, and Tom France over at Caterpillar, both of whom I think have been really sort of exceptional communicators about their company's supply chains and making it clear not just to their people, but to their partners, their service providers and partners and suppliers, that this is a serious, game-changing, transformational initiative that they're embarking on. And then ultimately, that kind of rolls right out through shareholders and the way the company is perceived. So again, I go back to the best companies are going to be supply chain companies, and you need to communicate it. And so that communication is not going to necessarily come from a traditional PR department. It's got to come from supply chain executives, and they've got to be very, very good at it.
Yeah, you raised the point about data quality management, and I completely agree with that. I mean, I think I think one of the challenges that companies have faced, and one of the reasons why it's been such an issue for so many years, is that who owns data quality management, right? And I think that's not a clear answer at a lot of companies. There's a lot of finger pointing that goes on. Operational people tend to say, well, that's IT's problem, right? IT needs to solve that. And IT says, no, 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 that's not us. Have your trading partner send us clean data and we'll be all set, right? Or it's the assumption that, it's everybody's responsibility, but there's no clear governance or processes in place to how to do that. So I think that is, I'm glad you brought that up, because I firmly agree with that as well. And your last point, I think, answered in part my next question, which is, there's so many competing projects and initiatives within companies. How do you get the CEO and CFO kind of on board? How do you get their buy-in, for supply chain visibility and connectivity and synchronization? I mean, it sounds like, per your last point, that being able to tell that story kind of increases supply chain knowledge within internally is part of the answer. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So what's your take on that?
I think every supply chain course that's taught today needs to, every supply chain program, as young professionals are coming up, needs to include a communications dimension. I think that supply chain executives today have to be like politicians. They have to be driven and focused on the vision, that end state, and they have to carry the message to the rest of their organization. Companies will not succeed, they will not win, they will not grow unless they're operationally excellent, and that's supply chain. So communications is a big part of that, and that may not be obvious to everybody. This is, but the times have changed, the world has changed, and now, if we're going to win, if companies are going to win, they not only have to be good operationally, they have to be good at talking about and communicating that they're good at it and why it's important, and they have to make the case and articulate to senior management. And I think we are seeing CEOs that are supply chain operational people, and so the profile of that supply chain executive is going to change. And I think you can't drive change inside your company merely by being a good operational person. You've got to be a great communicator.
Yeah, great point. I think the other key point is that I think it's somewhat obvious, but sometimes it falls through the cracks, is that you really have to, at the end of the day, be able to connect what you're doing in supply chain with the financial metrics that the CEO and CFO care about, right? So it's, being able to point to what you're doing in supply chain, to items on the balance sheet and the income statement and so forth, because those are the metrics that, they live and breathe by. And if you're able to, clearly communicate and demonstrate that link, I think that helps as well in terms of getting that buy-in, from senior management. Greg, we're kind of running out of time here, so let's just get to the last question here, kind of as a way to wrap up. For anyone listening today, either live or on demand, what questions should companies ask themselves to assess their, supply chain, trading partner connectivity and visibility capabilities to determine whether they're, best in class or not, or whether they need improvement, and what should be the first step they take to kind of get closer to that promised land?
Well, in some ways, I mean, I have a sort of a bias or a preference to metrics now that look not just at the performance levels we talked about, on time and in full, and inventory levels and operational spend, but data metrics. And one of the metrics that I talk about now quite a bit is real-time information access. What we call RIAD, real-time information access time, the time that it takes to get to a specific piece of information. So, for example, you could take any part of your executional network, look at one of the common ones in logistics, which is shipment status, the status of the shipment. You basically have an identifier. It could be a bill of lading number, or it could be a container number, or you might want to get to it through an order number. But how long does it take you? I mean, if you take your best operators, put them in front of a laptop like we're in front of right now, Adrian, in front of our laptops, and take them through a series of random shipments in the network, and track how fast they can get to accurate status and detailed status. And in our world, that response time should be less than 20 seconds. It should be less than 10 seconds. And we have operators on our network, we have customers on our network that can get to detailed information about shipments, about inventory, about orders that quickly. And so we're at the beginning of, I think, another set of metrics which define how fast a company and its operators can get to information quickly. And by the way, I don't mean just the operators. I mean executives. I mean, if you're an executive, pull out your phone right now and pull up the application on your iPhone or your Android that tells you where that hot order is and who it's going to and whether there's a problem with it. Or what are the 5 top exceptions in your network right now that are at risk? Do you have a crystal ball? And I think there's some intuitive stuff you can do right now to get a sense of how bad it is. And there are companies emerging that do a very good job of it. So benchmarking and talking with other partners or peers in your network is a good way to get kind of an approximate sense. But there are some rigorous practices now emerging around RIAT and the time that it takes to get information. I think that's a great way to do a diagnostic. Do a diagnostic as a next step across your network. And these can be fast. They don't have to be months. They're hours or days to determine just very quickly. It's a health check. How quickly can we get to the information we need anywhere around our value chain? And if you can't do that, then I doubt that you're really automating processes and driving value.
Great advice. I love that. Kind of taking that metric as a test or as an assessment tool to see where you're at. As you were talking there in terms of time, I think another metric that might be worthwhile to look at, that might be a little bit longer term to kind of investigate, is time to resolution in terms of from a risk management standpoint. So whenever a supply chain disruption occurs within your network, how long does it take you to get back to normal? And I think a key part of being able to do that is having that visibility and having that advanced visibility to what's happening in your supply chain network so that you can take proactive action, or once an event occurs, be able to resolve it as quickly as possible. So I think that's another metric that I like to talk about and think about from a risk management angle. But I think that's also a key area where these types of platforms can have a very important role in. And certainly risk management is something that's becoming much more important and getting higher visibility within the C-suite at companies as well. So, Greg, as always, when we do these programs, we manage just to scratch the surface on this topic, but we definitely, I think, address a lot of key points. I'm sure that next week I'll come back with a lot of great ideas and insights from some of your customers and the presentations I'll see there. But certainly it's a topic that we'll continue to write about and talk about here on Talking Logistics in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you very much for taking time today to be with us.
Thank you for including me, Adrian. I look forward to seeing you at Bridges next week.
Great. And for those of you that are watching this on demand, if you do have a question for Greg, you can find the episode on talkinglogistics.com. You can go ahead and post a question or comment there, and I'm sure Greg would be happy to respond via that platform as well. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.